He walked into the hospital he owned, thinking it was just another meeting. But that day, a little voice stopped him cold, one question piercing through every wall he'd built around his heart. "Sir, where can I buy a heart for my mommy?" Before we dive into today's story, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what's the time there right now? And if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Ethan Cole walked through the gleaming glass doors of St. Grace Memorial Hospital, his shoes clicking against the pristine marble floor with the precision of a man used to being obeyed. He had built this hospital from the ground up, turning it into one of the most advanced medical centers in the city, yet he rarely visited its corridors unless there was business to handle. Today was supposed to be just that, a quick board meeting, a few signatures, and then back to his corner office overlooking the skyline. His tailored blue suit was sharp enough to reflect the morning light streaming through the tall windows, and his tie was perfectly knotted, every detail about him screaming control, order, and detachment. But as he crossed the polished hallway toward the elevator, a tiny shadow appeared in his path, halting his stride. He felt the faintest tug on his sleeve, so small and delicate that for a moment, he thought he had imagined it. Looking down, he saw her. A little girl no older than 6, her golden hair catching the light like spun sunlight, her bright yellow dress slightly wrinkled as if she had been sitting on the floor moments before. She tilted her head up, her blue eyes locking onto his with an intensity that startled him. They were the kind of eyes that seemed to carry an entire story in a single glance, impossibly clear yet carrying a sadness too heavy for such a young face. Her voice, small and trembling but somehow steady enough to cut through the quiet of the corridor, rose like a fragile thread between them. "Sir, do you know where I can buy a heart? My mommy's is broken, and the doctor says she might go to heaven soon." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. For a heartbeat, the sterile white world around him seemed to fade away. The distant beeping of monitors, the hushed voices of nurses, even the faint scent of disinfectant all blurred into the background. Ethan's pulse stumbled, his breath catching in a way that felt foreign to him. He was a man who negotiated million-dollar deals without flinching, who faced down competitors without so much as a flicker of doubt. But this question from a stranger no taller than his waist had stripped him bare in an instant. He lowered himself to one knee, his polished shoes creaking faintly, until he was eye level with her. Up close, those eyes were even more striking, blue like a summer sky, but with a depth that made him feel as though he was staring into something achingly familiar. "What did you just say?" His voice was softer than he expected, almost hesitant, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment between them. She opened her mouth, perhaps to repeat herself or to explain, but before a single word could escape, a nurse in pale scrubs hurried toward them, her expression tight with concern. The woman crouched beside the girl, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her tone both kind and urgent. "You shouldn't be here." The girl's small fingers reluctantly released the fabric of Ethan's sleeve, and for a fleeting second, her gaze lingered on him, as if she wanted to say more but couldn't. Then she was guided away, her bright dress swaying as she walked, her golden hair glinting under the harsh white lights until she disappeared around a corner. Ethan remained frozen in place, his eyes fixed on the empty space where she had stood. A strange, unsettling tightness gripped his chest. Not the kind that came from stress or exhaustion, but something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. He straightened slowly, his mind still caught on the echo of her question, the way her voice had wavered between innocence and desperation. And then there were her eyes, those impossibly blue eyes that had stared into his like a mirror reflecting something long buried. He didn't know why, but the sight of them had struck him with a familiarity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He had never seen her before, he was certain of that. Yet somehow, in some inexplicable way, it felt as though he had known her all his life. And as the nurse's hurried footsteps faded into the distance, Ethan Cole, master of his own empire, a man who prided himself on logic and reason, found himself standing in the middle of his own hospital, shaken to the core by a question he could neither answer nor forget, and by a pair of eyes that felt like they had been waiting for him all along. The nurse's hurried footsteps had faded, but Ethan's mind remained restless, the question from that little girl burning like an ember in his thoughts as he stepped into the boardroom. Around him, the hospital's senior executives discussed quarterly reports, new equipment budgets, and upcoming charity events, their voices a steady hum, but to him, it was all background noise. His eyes occasionally flicked to the frosted glass door, as though half expecting the child to reappear. He tried to focus. His name was called once, twice, but every syllable spoken in that room felt meaningless compared to the echo in his head. "Sir, where can I buy a heart for my mommy?" His pen tapped against the table, his polished shoes shifted restlessly under the weight of his thoughts. Finally, when the meeting broke into a lull, he leaned toward the head nurse seated beside him, lowering his voice in a way that was uncharacteristic of his usual commanding tone. "The little girl in the hallway earlier. Who is she?" The question drew a flicker of hesitation across the nurse's face. She adjusted her glasses, buying herself a moment, then sighed as though choosing her words carefully. "That's Lily Parker," she said quietly. "She's been visiting her mother here for weeks now. Advanced heart failure. We've been searching for a compatible donor, but so far—" Her sentence trailed off, the weight of what she left unsaid hanging heavy between them. Ethan absorbed the information in silence, but the name, Lily Parker, lodged itself firmly in his mind. A pulse of unease traveled through him, sharper now, as though some invisible thread was pulling him toward an answer he wasn't ready to face. The meeting eventually ended, the others shuffling out, but instead of heading toward his office or the elevator, Ethan found his steps turning down a quieter corridor, one that led away from public areas. His polished shoes made soft, deliberate clicks against the tile floor as he approached a secured workstation. He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. He knew this was against protocol. Unauthorized access to the patient database was a violation he himself had enforced countless times, but something in him refused to walk away. Sliding his ID card through the reader, he waited for the soft chime of access granted, then typed quickly. His fingers steady, though his heartbeat wasn't. The sterile blue-white glow of the monitor reflected in his eyes as he scrolled through records, searching by last name, Parker. Several entries appeared, staff members, past patients, but when he saw Lily Parker listed with a guardian's name beneath, his gaze narrowed. He clicked into the file, scrolling through the emergency contact and family details, until a secondary listing caught his attention. Mother, Grace Parker. The sight of it stopped him cold. For a long moment he simply stared at the name, the letters blurring slightly as an unexpected rush of memories clawed at the edges of his mind. Grace Parker. Grace. The name was not just familiar. It was unforgettable, etched into the deepest parts of him like a scar that had never truly healed. He leaned back in his chair, but the air in the small room felt suddenly thinner, heavier. His mind began to drift unbidden, unspooling images from another time, soft laughter on a rainy afternoon, eyes that held warmth even when she was angry, the faint scent of jasmine clinging to her hair. It couldn't be. After all these years? He forced himself to breathe, to focus, to push the rising tide of emotions back under the surface, yet the thought wouldn't let go. Grace Parker, in this hospital, battling for her life. And a little girl named Lily, her daughter, wandering the halls, asking strangers where to buy a heart. Ethan's jaw tightened, his hand still resting on the mouse, his knuckles pale against the dark wood of the desk. Logic told him it could be a coincidence, but his gut whispered that life didn't deal coincidences this sharp, this cruel, this deliberate. The cursor blinked on the screen as if waiting for him to make a choice, and in that moment, Ethan realized he had no choice at all, because if this was the same Grace he had loved and lost 6 years ago, nothing in the world could stop him from finding out why she was here, and why fate had brought her back into his orbit. Ethan left the records room with his heart pounding in a way he had never experienced in a boardroom. The hall ahead of him felt longer than it should, stretching endlessly under the dim hospital lights. Each step echoed faintly against the polished floor, the sound too loud in the otherwise quiet corridor. His eyes stayed fixed forward, scanning each number plate mounted beside the patient doors. He passed the gentle hum of oxygen machines filtering into the air. A nurse pushing a cart glanced at him but said nothing, sensing the focus in his stride. He passed a family huddled in a waiting area, their faces tight with worry. The atmosphere here was different, more private, more fragile. The brass number 304 came into view at the end of the hall. He slowed, his breath unsteady despite his effort to control it. His hand hovered over the door handle for a moment longer than necessary. What if it wasn't her? What if it was? Drawing in a measured breath, he pushed the door open. The faint creak of the hinges was swallowed by the steady beep of a heart monitor. Soft, warm light spilled from a small lamp near the bed. There she was. Grace. Even weakened, she carried the same quiet beauty that had once captivated him completely. Her skin was pale, but her features were untouched by time. Her lips were slightly parted in surprise. Her eyes, still that same deep, unguarded gaze, locked on his instantly. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The weight of 6 years seemed to press down between them. Finally, she broke the silence. Her voice was soft, hoarse, but steady. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" Hearing his name from her lips pulled him straight back into memories he thought he'd buried. He tried to form words, but his mouth felt dry. The air in the room seemed thicker, harder to breathe. 1,000 questions raced through his mind, fighting for space. Before he could speak, the door burst open again. A small figure ran in, golden hair catching the lamplight. It was her. The little girl from the hallway. "Mommy!" she cried, her voice bright in the otherwise hushed room. She ran straight to the bed. Grace opened her arms instantly, gathering the child close. The girl pressed her cheek against her mother's shoulder. Grace's fingers trembled as they held her tight. For a moment, the woman on the bed wasn't a patient, she was simply a mother holding her child. The girl turned her head, glancing back toward Ethan. "Mommy, this nice man said he'll help you." Her words were simple, but they landed with unexpected weight. Ethan felt a strange twist in his chest. The sight of them together stirred something he couldn't name. Grace's expression shifted as she looked at him again. The softness in her eyes vanished, replaced with something guarded. She pulled her daughter a little closer, protectively. Her gaze never wavered from his. When she spoke, her tone carried a sharpness that cut through the air. "Ethan, she's not just asking for help." Each word was measured, deliberate. Her eyes didn't blink. "She's asking her father." The words hung there, unshaken, undeniable, and you don't even know it. For a moment, the monitor's beeping was the only sound in the room. The air between them was thick enough to touch. Ethan felt the floor shift beneath him, not physically but in the way his entire world suddenly tilted. The word father echoed in his head like a drumbeat. He searched her face for any sign of hesitation. There was none. Her expression was steady, resolute. It was not a mistake. It was not a metaphor. It was a truth she had just laid bare without warning. His gaze shifted to the girl, Lily, still nestled in Grace's arms. Those eyes. The same piercing blue as his own. The realization began to take shape, fragile but undeniable. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. No words felt adequate. The weight of the moment pinned him where he stood. His mind reached back through years of silence and separation. The gap between them suddenly felt impossible to cross. And yet, here they were. Grace's fingers stroked her daughter's hair, her touch gentle despite the tension in her voice moments ago. Ethan's hands remained at his sides, rigid. His heart pounded, each beat loud in his ears. A part of him wanted to step forward. Another part feared what would happen if he did. The girl's small hand rested on her mother's chest, right above the failing heart. The image seared itself into his mind. A mix of disbelief, guilt, and something dangerously close to longing churned inside him. His eyes met Grace's again. She didn't look away. Her expression told him she had more to say, but for now, she let the silence do the talking. The truth had been spoken. It could not be taken back. It could not be ignored. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had drawn closer. The air was warm from the lamp but cold from the weight of what he'd just heard. Every detail around him sharpened. The faint rustle of Lily's dress as she shifted, the slow rise and fall of Grace's chest, the quiet hum of the medical equipment. Time felt suspent. Then Ethan swallowed hard, the motion tight in his throat. Something inside him shifted, slowly, reluctantly, but irreversibly. His gaze dropped briefly to the floor, then returned to the two figures on the bed. The reality settled like a heavy stone in his chest. If Grace was telling the truth, and he could see no reason to doubt her, everything he thought he knew about his life had just changed. His pulse quickened again. The silence felt like a question neither of them was ready to answer. Lily's small voice broke it. "Mommy, are you okay?" she whispered. Grace smiled faintly, but her eyes never left his. He had no answer for either of them, only the weight of a truth he wasn't ready to face. And the knowledge that nothing between them would ever be the same again. The moment Grace's trembling words spilled into the sterile air of room 304, Ethan felt as though the ground beneath him had vanished. Every syllable carried the weight of 6 stolen years, 6 years where love had been suffocated under the cold hand of his own blood, 6 years where his life had moved forward but his heart, without him knowing, had been left behind with the woman before him, pale and frail yet still holding the same quiet fire in her eyes. She spoke in halting breaths, recounting how his family, draped in the authority of power and pride, had cornered her into leaving, how they had called her unworthy, a stain on the family's image, and she, terrified for him and for the life growing inside her, had vanished without protest, thinking it was the only way to protect him. Ethan's chest ached as she told him about the mornings she had woken sick yet forced herself to keep going, working endless hours while her belly grew, whispering his name into the dark because it was the only piece of him she had left. She explained how, after Lily was born, she had swallowed her fear and sent letters, please for him to know the truth, but each envelope returned, unopened, the cold stamp of rejection on their surface slicing her deeper than any blade. Ethan's mind spun in disbelief until the image of his former assistant surfaced, a man who had been with him in those years and whom he'd trusted completely, and the horrifying realization struck. Those letters never reached him, not because Grace hadn't tried, but because betrayal had been sitting in his own office, hiding in plain sight. His throat tightened as his gaze drifted to Lily, standing quietly by the bed, her tiny hands curled protectively around her mother's arm. And suddenly those eyes, bright, ocean blue, were not a coincidence. The sunlight through the blinds caught her golden hair in a halo, and in that moment the truth slammed into him with a force that nearly knocked him breathless. His voice was barely a whisper, raw with awe and regret. "She's mine." And Grace, her lips trembling, gave the smallest nod, tears spilling freely, not from guilt but from the unbearable relief of finally letting the truth breathe. Ethan's vision blurred as guilt crashed over him in relentless waves, guilt for not fighting harder for her, for believing the lies his family spun, for every night he had slept in comfort while Grace had faced storms alone. But the time to process, to fall to his knees, and beg forgiveness, was stolen by the sharp beeping of the heart monitor beside her bed, the quickening rhythm telling him what his mind already knew. Grace was running out of time, the hollowness in her cheeks, the unnatural stillness in her body, the way her breaths came shallow, each one like a coin spent from a purse with nothing left. He could feel the urgency clawing at him. He reached for her hand, holding it as if by grip alone he could anchor her to this world, his mind racing through every connection, every favor he could call in, every hospital in the country that might hold the key to saving her. But beneath the urgency was something deeper, something that twisted the knife in his chest. This wasn't just about saving a patient. It was about saving the only woman he had ever truly loved, the mother of his child, the family he had been robbed of before it ever began. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as Lily's innocent eyes flicked between them, sensing in her young heart that something monumental had just been revealed. Grace squeezed his hand faintly, a shadow of her former strength, but still enough to send a silent message. She hadn't told him to guilt him. She had told him because the truth deserved to be heard before it was too late. Ethan swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as the truth burned into his bones. He had already lost 6 years, but if he didn't act now, he could lose everything forever. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears as he left Grace's room, the weight of her worsening condition pressing down on him like a vice, and the words of the doctor echoing endlessly in his mind, each syllable slicing deeper. Time was running out, and if he didn't act now, Lily might lose her mother forever. He didn't hesitate. Within minutes, his office was a war room. Every assistant, every contact, every favor he had ever earned, suddenly called in as if the entire city's heartbeat depended on it. He ordered his private jet to be fueled and on standby, contacted top surgeons across the country, even rang specialists overseas, offering blank checks and lifetime retainers if they could find a heart that matched Grace's fragile body. In between these frantic calls, he found himself drifting back to the pediatric wing, unable to resist the pull of Lily's laughter as she sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by tiny plastic bricks, her little hands carefully snapping Lego pieces together. He crouched beside her, helping her construct a crooked castle that leaned slightly to one side, and when she grinned up at him with those impossibly blue eyes, something inside him shifted. He wasn't the Mal, and who closed billion-dollar deals anymore. He was a father who couldn't bear to fail his child. At night, when visiting hours ended, he stayed in the waiting lounge, reading her the same bedtime story 3 times because she liked the way he made the dragon's voice sound, and when she finally drifted off to sleep against his arm, he sat there for hours, memorizing the weight of her head on his shoulder. Days blurred into each other, a whirlwind of phone calls, hospital corridors, and whispered promises he made to Grace when she was too weak to keep her eyes open. Then, one rain-slick afternoon, his phone rang with the call that jolted him to his core. The donor had been found, a perfect match, a chance to pull Grace back from the brink. He almost collapsed from relief, already imagining the moment he could tell Lily her mother was going to be okay. But then the doctor's voice changed, the hopeful tone giving way to a razor edge of urgency. The donor was in another city, hundreds of miles away, and due to a freak storm, all commercial flights were grounded. The heart would not arrive in time through normal channels, and every passing minute increased the risk that it would become unusable. Ethan's mind raced. This wasn't a deal he could negotiate. This was a battle against the clock, and the only thing that mattered was getting that heart to the operating room before it was too late. The doctor's final words were blunt and unforgiving. If you want to save her, you'll have to make it happen yourself. In that moment, Ethan knew there was no limit to what he would do, no law he wouldn't bend, no risk he wouldn't take, no storm he wouldn't fly through, because losing Grace was no longer an option. Under the howl of the raging snowstorm, Ethan stood on the hospital rooftop, the icy wind biting into his skin like 1,000 needles, but his resolve burned hotter than any winter could freeze. The doctor's words still echoed in his ears, the heart won't make it in time, and that was when he made the decision that would either save Grace or destroy him. Without hesitation, he called for his helicopter, ignoring the incredulous looks from the medical staff who told him it was suicide to fly in such weather, but to him, there was no other choice because every second wasted was a second closer to losing Grace forever. And now, as he strapped himself in, the rotors chopping the frigid air above him, memories crashed over him in vivid flashes. Grace standing at the edge of the pier on a warm summer day, her smile lighting up everything around her. The way her laughter used to tumble out, unguarded and pure. The trembling in her voice the night she told him she loved him for the first time, and then the shattering silence that followed when she was gone without explanation, leaving him empty and half a man, not knowing she carried his child inside her. The thought of Lily, with her golden hair and impossibly familiar blue eyes, hit him so hard his grip on the controls tightened until his knuckles turned white, and he whispered into the headset as though she could hear him from miles away, "I won't lose them again, I swear it," before pushing the throttle forward and lifting into the furious white void. The city lights below vanished instantly under the blinding veil of snow, the wind buffeting the aircraft like an angry beast trying to rip it from the sky. But Ethan's mind was locked on one image, Grace in that hospital bed, pale and fading, her hand weakly curled around Lily's. Instruments beeped warnings in his ears, Turbulence jolted him violently, and every gust seemed determined to spin the helicopter into chaos. Yet he fought back with a precision born not just of skill, but of desperation, each movement of the stick a silent prayer. Through the blur of frost and sleet, he could barely make out the dim outline of the city where the heart waited, his GPS flickering, and in that moment, another memory slammed into him. Grace's tearful eyes the day his family had pushed her away, her voice choked with the words she was never allowed to finish, and he realized with a sharp pang that all this time, it wasn't fate that kept them apart, but choices made by people who thought they knew what was best for him. The bitterness of that truth only fueled his determination, and as he broke through another violent crosswind, he muttered through clenched teeth, "Not this time," as though speaking directly to those who had once taken her from him. The cold seeped through his gloves, the glass in front of him fogging, alarms blaring as ice began forming on the rotor blades, forcing him to dip lower toward the tree line, dodging dark shapes that could be buildings or trees, his heart pounding in sync with the thump of the rotors. His radio crackled with urgent warnings from ground control to turn back, but he silenced it without a word, because turning back meant surrender, and surrender meant watching Grace slip away, and that was something his soul simply could not allow. As the storm thickened, his mind wavered between fear and fierce determination. But each time doubt crept in, the image of Lily's little hands fitting perfectly into his, like they'd always been meant to, pulled him back from the brink, and he pressed on. An hour felt like days, his muscles aching from the constant fight against the wind, but at last, through the swirling white chaos, he spotted the faint blinking light of the donor team's location, a beacon in the storm. Relief surged through him, almost making him dizzy, but there was no time to rest. Landing would be just as dangerous as the flight itself. Gripping the controls, he guided the helicopter down onto a rooftop barely big enough for the skids, the machine shuddering violently as it touched down. Medics rushed forward, clutching the precious container that held Grace's only chance, their faces pale from the cold, and without waiting for formalities, Ethan secured it himself, tucking it into the cabin like it was the most fragile thing in the world, because in a way it was. With the CO. Safely aboard, he turned the craft back toward the hospital, knowing the return trip would be even worse with the wind shifting, but a fire burned in him now, brighter than the storm could ever smother, because he was no longer just flying through the snow, he was carrying the hope, the future, and the life of the woman he loved, and the daughter he had just found, and nothing on earth could make him let go. Under the harsh glare of the rooftop floodlights, Ethan's helicopter blades slowed to a stop, the deafening roar fading into the cold night air, replaced by the thundering in his chest. The cooler in his hands felt heavier than its size should allow, the weight of Grace's fragile hope sealed inside. The surgical team, clad in green scrubs and urgency, met him with gurneys and sterile gloves, whisking the precious cargo into the building without a moment's pause, leaving him standing on the helipad with snowflakes melting against his hot skin, his breath ragged from the storm he had fought through. He followed down the stairwell, heart pounding, every echo of his footsteps a countdown to the moment that would decide everything. Inside the hospital corridors, the scent of antiseptic stung his nostrils, mingling with memories. Grace laughing under summer skies, her hand warm in his, her eyes alight with trust before it all shattered. His legs carried him on instinct until he reached the waiting area, where Lily sat curled on a chair, her small hands gripping the stuffed rabbit he had bought her from the gift shop hours ago. The moment she saw him, she ran into his arms, the word "Daddy" tumbling from her lips so naturally it tore something deep inside him, and he crouched low, promising in a whisper that he had done everything possible, that her mommy was in the best hands now. The OR doors swung closed behind the team, locking Grace's fate in a sterile world of bright lights and masked faces, and time became an enemy, each tick of the clock a drop of acid in his veins. He sat beside Lily, reading from her favorite book though his voice cracked, building Lego towers on the floor that toppled when his hands shook too much, telling her stories about brave knights who never gave up. All while his mind replayed every moment he had failed Grace, every letter returned unopened, every night she must have cried alone. Nurses passed in and out, their clipped footsteps echoing like the seconds slipping away, and Ethan found himself pacing, staring at the double doors as if sheer will could push them open. At one point, he leaned against the wall, his head in his hands, silently begging whatever force had spared him through the storm to spare Grace now. Hours bled into each other until exhaustion weighed on Lily's eyelids, and she drifted to sleep with her head in his lap, the slow rise and fall of her breathing the only thing keeping him tethered to the moment. Then, finally, the doors opened, and the surgeon stepped out, mask pulled down, eyes soft but grave, and Ethan rose so fast he nearly woke Lily. The world seemed to hold its breath until the words came. "She's stable. She's going to make it." Ethan's knees went weak, and he let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh, clutching the back of a chair for support. Lily stirred, blinking up at the man in white, and when she heard the news, tears welled instantly, spilling down her cheeks as she flung her arms around Ethan's neck with surprising strength. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered, and those 3 words seared into his soul like a brand, melting the last of the walls he had built over years of regret. He held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the reality of this new bond, something pure, fragile, and unbreakable, while beyond the glass, Grace lay recovering, her heart now beating with a rhythm borrowed from a stranger but sustained by his relentless fight. Yet even as relief flooded him, a shadow lingered at the edge of his thoughts. Saving her life was one thing. Earning her forgiveness would be another battle entirely, one that might cost him more than any storm ever could. And as he glanced toward the recovery ward, he wondered if the woman he had loved and lost would ever look at him the same way again. The days after the surgery passed in a blur of cautious relief, the sterile scent of the hospital still clinging to the air as snow whispered against the tall windows. But for Grace, every breath felt like a miracle earned, her cheeks now carrying a healthy flush instead of the pale fragility that had haunted her for weeks, her eyes brighter though still lined with the shadows of the ordeal. She sat propped up by pillows, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor a steady reminder of the life pulsing within her, a gift that had arrived against all odds, while the muted hum of nurses moving in the hallway created a cocoon of quiet around the small room. The door creaked open and Ethan stepped inside, his frame filling the doorway for a moment before he crossed the room with uncharacteristic hesitation, the weight of every missed year pressing into his chest, and in his hand, clutched almost like a peace offering, was a plush teddy bear with a red ribbon around its neck, its soft brown fur in stark contrast to the sharp cut of his tailored coat. Lily, perched on the chair beside Grace's bed, looked up with wide, expectant eyes, and when she saw the bear, her face bloomed into the kind of smile that could melt the iciest of storms, her small hands reaching out as Ethan crouched down so they were eye level, his knees pressing into the cool linoleum as he placed the bear into her arms. But even as he did, his gaze remained locked on Grace, 1,000 unsaid words flickering between them in the space of a heartbeat. "I can't change the past," he began, his voice low, almost breaking under the weight of what use had he had to say, "but I want to be here for both of you, if you'll let me." The silence that followed was not cold, it was full, thick with the history they had shared, the wounds they had both carried, the choices that had once pulled them apart, and Grace, still holding his gaze, studied him as though she could see straight through to the man beneath the titles and the mistakes. The seconds stretched, snow falling heavier outside, each flake catching the glow of the street lamps beyond the window, until at last, her lips curved into the faintest smile, not one of dismissal, nor one of pity, but of recognition. "We were never strangers, Ethan," she said softly, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had walked through fire and returned with her heart intact. "You've always been her father. Welcome home." In that moment, something shifted, years of distance dissolving into nothing as Lily, still clutching the bear, reached out with her free hand to grasp Ethan's fingers, and Grace's hand followed, their palms meeting in the middle in a tangle of warmth and quiet forgiveness. They stood there together, a triangle bound not by perfection, but by the decision to stay, to rebuild, to choose love in the face of everything that had once made it impossible. Beyond the glass, the world was muffled in white, the snow falling endlessly, the city softened into something almost magical, and the three of them, framed by that gentle winter light, became a picture not of wealth or power, but of something rarer, a family found, and as the camera of our hearts pulled back, the image of their joined hands lingered against the backdrop of the storm, while the narrator's voice, quiet and sure, carried the truth like a promise. Sometimes, the heart we need can't be bought. It's given, freely, when we finally open our own.